Hello and welcome everybody. So on this video we're going to talk about how to use Trendline in trading. Let's jump right into it.
So what is a trend line? A trend line is a line that is drawn over a pivot high or under a pivot low to show the direction of the price. So if we have the price going up this way, these are actually the pivot highs, and then we have the lows right here. So if we should connect a trend line, we're going to connect the pivot highs, right, and also the pivot lows, right? So this is just giving us the direction that the market is actually going to the upside. In connecting pivot highs and pivot lows, at least we need 3 points. Now what is a line? If we have point A and we have point B and we should draw a line, we're just gonna connect these two, right? So this is actually a line from point A to point B, but for a trend line we need at least 1, 2 and also a third point, right? So that we can actually say that this is actually a trend. This is moving from point A to point B to point C. So this becomes a trend line with a direction. So here we are on Euro USD, and what we want to do is to draw trend lines of which the market is likely to respect, but we need at least 3 pivot points in order to establish a trend line in which the market is likely to respect. So we're starting from here. This is our first swing point, or this is our first pivot point, right? So let's fast forward this and see if we're gonna get other pivot points of which we can connect. So we have our second swing point, right? So connecting this, we have our first swing point, we have our second pivot point, right? So we are waiting to see if the market is actually going to tap on this trend line to create a third pivot point. If it does, then this trend line is actually a trend line that is respected by the market, right? So let's see. So right here you can see that we also have our third pivot point. So we have our first pivot point, second pivot point, third pivot point, which means that this trend line is actually being respected by the market, right? So we can actually extend this trend line, right, to see that in future if price comes to this trend line, then there could be a possible reaction. So let's see. So we can actually see how the market has respected this trend line, right? So in future, if we see price coming back to this area, of course we can actually anticipate a direction to the downside, right? And if we get here, we can also extend our trend line and also anticipate a direction to the upside, right? So the market is actually trading in between these pivot highs and pivot lows. The trend line can also be used as support and resistance levels. So you can clearly see how the market is actually rejecting at the trend lines, right? So this is actually our resistance trend line. Whenever the market gets to the resistance trend line, the market drops. As we know, support and resistance is the roof, the support is the floor. So whenever the market gets to the resistance, there is a drop, and whenever we get to the support, there is a bounce to the upside, right? So this is our resistance trend line of which the market is actually pushing to the downside. This is also our resistance. We have our support right here, resistance, support, resistance, support. So this is actually a support trend line. This is a resistance trend line on the downtrend. On an uptrend, we can also see that whenever the market touches the trend line, there is a bounce to the upside. We touch this trend line, then a move to the upside, come back to the trend line, a move, come back to the trend line, and move, right? So this is actually our support trend line, which is pushing price to the upside, and this becomes our resistance trend line, which is also causing price to the downside, right? So in future, if we see price here, what we can do is we can anticipate a future direction to the upside. Why? Because we are at the support trend line. Now we know the uses of the trend line. So the trend line actually helps us to predict the future movement of price. It also helps us to identify the direction of price. And also the trend line helps us to identify a change of trend. So what do I mean? Right here we can see that the trend is actually going up, right? So we have an uptrend by the help of this trend line, right? So we have our support trend line, we have our resistance trend line. So we can see that price is actually going to the upside. Now let's fast forward this. Here you can see that the price broke this trend line. This is a first indication that the price is likely to reverse, right? Why? Because price has broken this trend line, and clearly you can see that price actually shifted from an uptrend and then started going to the downside. How were we able to identify this? By the break of the trend line. So this is how powerful the trend line is, and this is how we can use it to actually capitalize in the market.